Chuck, it's great to see you today.
Hey, Jason.
Chuck, you were a former squadron leader in Navy SEAL Team 6. And when you look at what's happening now in Ukraine, you probably hear what a lot of people are hearing, which is Ukraine is not doing well in Kursk. And in Eastern Ukraine, things are becoming more difficult. How bad do you think it really is? Or do you think that people are just being too pessimistic about the situation? What do you see?
Well, the one thing I regret to say is that I joined a lot of other military analysts who watched this war closely and knew that this summer was going to be just what we're seeing. We were going to see Russia resurgent in the summer, and those cards were dealt last Christmas when Mike Johnson decided that he would pull a stunt and retard the very important, necessary, fundamental military aid going to Ukraine. Uh, I remember you and I worked on an op-ed back there, and we called this coming summer, the one we're in, as the time of consequence. And we've seen it. I remember railing at the time that Mike Johnson had added at least a year to this war, and that is 2024. Congratulations. The war was fought the way it had to be fought in 2024 because Ukraine did not have the resources. And I bang this all the time. If I could just give Ukraine two things, just two, I'd give them air defenses adequate to defend their cities and their frontline forces, and I would give them the deep strike capability so they didn't have to fight Russian soldiers on the zero line. They could destroy those Russian soldiers in their trucks 100 miles from the zero line. So what alarmed me? Not much. I saw all of this coming. But and again, you don't have to be a genius to see it coming. Just look at what gets sent and look at the daily battle requirements. So that's unfortunately that's what I thought was going to happen. I'd like to ask you though. You're there. We both understand the importance of, let's use the clinical term, inflecting the information space. How do you see this negativity that we see in the West? How does it play in Ukraine? Is it is the climate there much different? Are there more rational voices? Um, that's interesting to me on the real home front, which is Ukraine.
So here in Ukraine, I can tell you is that obviously people are concerned by any sort of thing that does not go well in the war, but they're very optimistic, despite the fact that typically the media picks up the rare cases. They'll find somebody trying to flee the country to avoid the military and write an entire story about it. But the fact is, there's tens of thousands of men joining the military willfully. There is an increased number of people deciding to join the military service, but there's also, I think, within the society as a whole, an ongoing desire to win. I've not seen this defeatism. I've not seen any signs that people are ready to give up. I don't see any indications of that. Likewise, I think that we've passed the point where people feel that given the sacrifices that have been made, it's wrong to stop now. We must honor the lives of those who have died by fighting for what they fought for and not forgetting this. So I think as a society as a whole, Ukrainians wish to continue fighting. Simply, they're reliant on the West. So if the United States or if Europe decided tomorrow to discontinue its support for Ukraine, Ukraine would not be able to win. But thanks to this assistance, it really leads to a different question. Why do we always ask, can Ukraine win? Why don't we ask, can Russia win? Because over time, looking at the losses that Russia has suffered, it's not tenable. Russia cannot do this eternally. Russia at some point gets in at too high of cost. And I think increasingly we're seeing the signs of that within Russia, which leads me to this belief that Ukraine, if it's well armed, can continue fighting and force Russia, due to the attrition, to begin its negotiations or to eventually be forced out of Ukrainian territory. How do you see it?
Well, if I hear someone say things are not going well in Kursk, I'd like to ask the obvious follow-up question: for who? Who's it not going bad for? Uh, Conservative estimates. This isn't me. I watch the war very closely, but I don't do casualty projections. UK Defense Intelligence estimates that in the months of May, June, and July, Russia lost 70,000 casualties. The locus of that fighting has been around Kursk, which is dare I say, the culmination of the fall of Avdiivka. After Avdiivka fell, the Russians were able to push westward. Uh, if you are to frame the Battle of Kursk as an attritional fight, that is one where you slug it out with the enemy in order to inflict damage on him, then the clear winner, not in terms of terrain gained or lost, but casualties inflicted, the clear winner is Ukraine. And also we look at what's being fought over Kursk. Well, that's just about as important as, let me think, Bakhmut. Should it be lost? It is not going to be a mortal wound for Ukraine. This isn't going to be the turning point of the war. It's just that simple. And Russia, they're burning up a lot of men, a lot of equipment to not much of an end, I think.
So when you look towards the other frontier, the one that Ukraine has opened by invading part of Kursk Oblast in Russia, what do you see going on there? How's the fight going?
Well, that's something that I've been watching very carefully. Uh, I don't usually talk about Ukrainian order of battle, but included in the forces that crossed the frontier were 3 battalions of Ukrainian Special Operations Forces. That is a lot of guys with funny berets on. And we look at the daily projections of the zero line north in Kursk. But I'd remind everybody who looks at the amount of terrain captured up there to bear in mind that hundreds and quite possibly thousands of Ukrainian special operations forces are operating 20 kilometers deeper than the zero line. So, what do I see? I see pontoon bridges being blown up as soon as the Russians can get them into position. I see engineering positions being targeted because putting up a pontoon bridge is one thing, taking out the equipment that allows you to put up the bridge is another. I see deep strikes on Russian convoys, dozens of kilometers back from the zero line. These are all deep strikes predicated on having special operations forces running, dare I say, at will in the Russian rear. So it's something to keep an eye on.
As I understand, Chuck, one advantage that Russia has always had historically is simply that it's larger. It's had a massive military against many European militaries that are simply smaller. One of the advantages that it thought it had fighting Ukraine was simply its size. But in this case, one advantage that Ukraine has had is that it has had long range weapons. Russia historically was able to simply outnumber other armies by coming and advancing at them at the same time, simply overwhelming them. But today, since Ukraine is able to successfully break up the supply routes for the Russian soldiers and prevent them from congealing around a point before attacking, it's giving Ukraine a huge advantage. What other advantages that you see that Ukraine has now that's defeating the axioms of earlier wars where Russia, due to its size, was almost sure to win?
Well, one of the most amazing ones is the fact that never in history has strategic bombardment. So think of the Allies bombing German ball bearing plants, oil refineries, what are known war college talk strategic targets. Never in history has that role been carried out by remote control aircraft, right? By long range drones. It sort of goes unremarked because we see it so much in this war, but it's never happened in history. And we're talking about targets that are getting hit 1,000, 2,000 kilometers from the zero line. And we know that General Budanov just the other day said 2,500. So those are some deep strikes. The other thing is Russian air defense was predicated on shooting down the supersonic and transonic airplanes that were going to be attacking those targets. So when you hit them with something that is flying at 500 feet and 90 miles an hour, as we're seeing, it gets through to the target. And Ukrainians the airframes that they're using in their UAVs, these have just increased in technological superiority and capability leaps and bounds. They started with something that looked like a scale model Cessna, but it could fly 1,000 kilometers. Now they have turbojet cruise missiles that have a solid rocket booster to sprint into the target. Pretty amazing. When it's not being turned out by Boeing, it's being turned out in Ukrainian garages.
So going ahead, though, Russian soldiers realize they're obviously at a disadvantage. Drones are constantly coming down at them, and life's becoming harder. How do you think it is that the Russian military has been able to keep itself together? As you've expressed, the Russians have lost tens of thousands of soldiers just in the past few months to take even a small village in Donbas. Why would Russians stick around? Why don't they flee? How do you think morale is now inside the Russian army?
We can get some tangible, concrete proof about how bad morale is by looking at the number of videos that Russian soldiers film from the front, gathered together, complaining about some life and death matters. As much as I have sympathy for those badly read, badly led, badly fed Russian soldiers, that's a mutinous assembly. You don't just get to do that in the military. There is no freaking suggestion box. And you don't get 30 of your friends and they say things are wrong. That is called mutiny and insubordination under the special circumstances of combat. So every time you see that, it's a capital offense. Okay, there's a concrete proof. Here's another thing that is a little harder to gauge, but I think a lot of military advisors, I know that General Hodges and General Ryan have joined me in this comment. The combat effectiveness of Russian units is appalling. They attack with 70 vehicles, they lose 5, and the entire attack breaks down and people run away. So morale is always one of the pillars of combat effectiveness. So we are seeing that all over the battlefield. And again, the losses just in the cross axis, if we're approaching 70,000 dead, okay, that's more than the United States lost in Vietnam in the entire war, 10 years. To take one satellite crossroads in terms of use of resources, return on investment, not so good.
So, but as somebody who does support Ukraine, don't you think that there are signs that things aren't going well? I mean, so much of the news media has been talking about Pokrovsk, Pokrovsk, Pokrovsk as if it was Stalingrad. It's such a vital interest. But I frankly don't understand that argumentation. What do you think it is to that? Why is the media so transfixed on this village, which they didn't know existed just a few months ago?
Well, that's just it. You get this, echo chamber in here, and so there's this large component. I don't want to say majority. There's this component in the information space, sort of saying this is important, this will be terrible. But a good thing to do is look who's saying it, right? If that person were a NATO general, if that person is Ben Hodges, then I would listen to it. But Ben Hodges' comment, as I recall, was, "What do people think this is? Stalingrad?" Because it simply is not. For example, the Russians invested a similar number of casualties to take Bakhmut. They finally did when there was nothing left of Bakhmut, but they still haven't gotten to Chasiv Yar. They took the city of Severodonetsk, but when Ukraine suddenly broke contact and readjusted the lines 20 kilometers, the Russians were too exhausted, disorganized, and screwed up to even follow them. So the War College talk for that in a battle is a unit is said to have culminated if it just can't do its job anymore. And we've seen that's what happens with the Russian army. They take Bakhmut, they're culminated. They can't go any farther. They take Severodonetsk, they're culminated. It's too early to say if across that battle has culminated, But it's not too early to say that the Russians have suffered, had they been made to pay for every millimeter of terrain that they have taken. And I will predict this: if Pokrovsk falls, it is not going to be the end of this war. They will have inherited a far flung outpost that they are going to have to pay to resupply and reinforce with longer lines of communication. It's going to cost them.
Chuck, I'd be curious what you think, though. Do you think that Russians still have hope that they can win? Do you think that they're still planning a large strategy to take Kyiv? Or what will happen next with Russia's invasion?
I see Russia continuing to do two things. They are going to continue to push towards Pokrovsk. That effort may wax and wane, but they won't stop trying to get there. I also see Putin gathering more and more forces to deal with the Kursk problem, which the Russians are going to discover that Ukraine has no intention of abandoning that space. They are going about right now to dig defensive positions, and these are not positions that ring the terrain they've captured. These are strong points within what they've captured, and that will secure their lines of communication and supply. At the very least, in Kursk, the Russians have got a fight that will take them all winter and into next spring. So, Jason, I'd like to ask you. You are closer. You are keeping a really close eye on European politics and military developments. What's changed over the summer? How does some of this naysaying? How does it affect our allies who are much closer to this problem than we are?
Well, undoubtedly, the biggest story over the past few months has been that Germany is looking to so greatly reduce the amount of assistance for Ukraine. Obviously, Germany is a key country providing support for Ukraine for its security. Now, there's been a lot of people who said that it's a coalition government and it'll probably work out in the end. But still, the threat of a decreased amount of support coming from Germany would be very threatening to Ukraine, especially when one considers that it's uncertain what will happen yet in the US elections. Can Washington be counted on? And so there is a lot of concern about being able to maintain a strong coalition that is willing to arm Ukraine, no matter what might happen next in America.
Well, the other thing I wanted to ask you is what what were the predicating circumstances, and what are the changes that you see might be happening with the President Zelensky's recent shakeup of the cabinet? Was this long in coming? Was this performance based? Was this optimizing, his ministers? How did you see that?
So Zelensky's shakeup of the government, which occurred last week, was something that I think most of us have been waiting for a long period of time, including even the foreign minister who was replaced. That was very high profile, but I think a lot of people expected it. Zelensky at this point is looking to shake things up. And we see that on multiple fronts, domestically with the change of ministers, but also in the war, deciding to go the path of invading Kursk. That is changing totally the paradigm about what this war is about and where frozen conflict would lead for Russia. So these shakeups are sort of fundamental to Zelensky's ability to maintain his own popularity nationally. It shows that he's still active, that he's trying new things, but internationally, reminding people, reminding the international community why they're helping Ukraine and that Ukraine does count on their support. Ukraine cannot afford to lose its friends abroad. And so right now, it is probably more important than at any other point in the past 2 years that those who support Ukraine remain active and remind others that Ukraine is a fight not just for its own self, but one that affects all of us in the West very directly.
Well, that's fundamentally my view as well. Somebody started this war out as a global superpower with a 72-hour plan for regime change. We're almost 900 days into that 72-hour military operation. And at the very least, Russia has inflicted hundreds of thousands of casualties on itself. They have demonstrated to military experts in the West, if not the population of Western nations, but to military analysts, they've demonstrated they're incapable of carrying out the kind of military evolutions that it's necessary to win this war.
Mm-hmm.
There is no 400-page plan on Putin's desk how to win this war. They are not going to come across the Belarusian border, bust out of Kupiansk, and steamroll Pokrovsk and close in on Kyiv. It's never going to happen. They don't have the leadership. They don't have the equipment. They don't have the willing manpower. Notice I said willing, and I said manpower instead of trained soldiers. So they're in this death spiral. It doesn't matter if they revamp their military and deliver hundreds of thousands of Green Beret quality trained troops to the front line. They're going to be led by people with no military talent, who've been in on the grift for 20 years, who couldn't lean a platoon of Marines to a cold beer. And we're seeing it. And it sounds funny, but they're not doing it. They can't. They don't have the means, and they don't have the motivation. So I agree with you. Things are going to wane and wax. Things are going to get better and they're going to get worse. But I stand by this prediction. Russia is not going to subdue Ukraine. They can't do it. And even I think the Kremlin is realizing that this is a sunk cost at this point.
Chuck, I think we agree. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your service.
Thank you, Jason. Good to talk to you, friend.